Hey everybody, this is Alzorath, and welcome to another episode of Friday Night Hex. Tonight I'm going to do something a little bit different from the previous 3 episodes, and I'm going to open the floor to your suggestions for future episodes. In the comments below, I would like everyone to basically request cards you would like to see in a card highlight segment of each episode, where I take a look at the advantages, disadvantages, and possible uses of various cards, both in constructed and draft play, as well as speculation as to how it will work in future expansions of the card set. I'm also open to specific subjects you'd like to hear about, but for now I'm going to be trying to keep it focused on the cards and possibly some strategy. If you guys want to know about drafting or something like that, if there's enough requests, I will go into it. And if you want to see some sample drafts, I could probably pull those off too, but it would take a little bit more time. Mostly this is just me preparing, and this is the kind of stuff that I look at whenever I'm preparing for the release of a new set or possibly getting into drafting in a new game. I look at the cards and I look at the combos. So that's what I look at here in Friday Night Hex. Though I suppose strategy would also be useful for people watching this series who are new to TCGs. So we'll see how the future episodes come out. We've got at least another month because they're saying that the alpha probably won't release until September. So we do have at least 4 more episodes of this. So I could cover the 4 more colors and possibly a couple more subjects closer to release. Now, that all aside, for this episode, since I don't have the luxury of having your suggestions, since I'm not psychic and can read the future, I decided to take a look at a handful of my favorite cards from my favorite school of magic, that is Blood. Now, what draws me to Blood is that it isn't necessarily stronger than any other color, but rather it's the fact that it represents the power at a cost mentality, like the dark colors in other TCGs do. And it looks to be moving more towards using a lot of very dynamic and flexible cards as well in Hex. From cheap chump blockers that shift from one form to another to avoid destruction, like our lovely little skeleton friend, to deck-sifting plagues that can maim or kill opposing creatures before they ever even get a chance to be drawn, much less played. And there's even some cards that punish your opponent for playing powerful abilities by stealing them. Now, to some, my selection of top 5 favorite cards may seem a bit weird, but that is because they're not necessarily the most powerful cards, but rather the ones that get the gears turning for me. They're cards that are interesting to me. They're cards that have multiple uses or possibly hint at different things that are extremely cool to me. We can save discussion on cards such as Murder, Corrupt Harvester, and Life Siphon for a later time or in a different circumstance, because they're fairly straightforward, and I actually prefer talking about the more esoteric or strange cards. So, yeah, without further ado, I'm going to stop rambling. Let's go ahead and jump into my top 5 Blood list. The ones that really interest me, and they're in no particular order because I can't rate them by 1 to 5th. You guys think I'm that organized? Heck no. So let's go ahead and look at the first one, and that is Blood Harbinger. Now, this one's going to be probably the most groany on the list, the one that most people are like, that's weak and I don't really like it. But Blood Harbinger to me is a type of card that, honestly, they've been mentioning this throughout Hex development. It's a card that has been basically described as punished for either choice. With Blood Harbinger, you basically have to ask, do I keep the Harbingers off the field by paying 5 life, or do I let them dig out a 3/1 into their hand? And while not frequently present, this type of card is exceptionally cool to me because it can force the opposing player to think in more tangents than they normally would against a normal creature or normal spell effect. And since they have to decide which is bad and which is worse, this can often lead to player mistakes and distractions, and any small hiccup in a thought or strategy can actually give you a big boost towards winning a match. Part of the strategy of winning is to throw your opponent off balance, especially whenever you're evenly matched. As soon as you take them onto the wrong level of thought, you have immediately thrown them into a place where you can take advantage of them. And it earns this spot simply because it is a card that forces that kind of situation. Now, as far as the stats, as I already mentioned, it's a 3/1 Orc Mage, but it's 2 cost and 2 blood threshold. Its card effect quite literally reads, when this troop dies, target opposing champion may pay 5 health. If they don't, search your deck for a Blood Harbinger and put it into your hand. Reading it through, not exceptional. It's not even a good draft pick because it's rare. It's a chump blocker at best, and you'll only get one of them at best in a draft. In Constructed, though, I can see a 4 of setup of these being quite punishing, especially with things such as recursion from Blood or multiplication from Sapphire, or the combination of these two things. And also with a number of buffs that are available to make it much bigger than a 3-1 in its presence. Now, with those combinations, you could easily put yourself in a situation where you have a swarm of clones with these effects and drawing them out of your deck and throwing them back in your deck and making it all kinds of a nasty mess for your opponent. It's a pretty complicated combo, so you're not going to see it a lot, but the potential is there for using this kind of effect to your advantage. Now, the thing is, though, this trick can only work so many times, especially if you don't have the combo set up for it, because, well, you only can have 4 in your deck starting out, at least. So, it's a very limited effect, but I do like the inclusion of the if not this, then that punishment effects, where you choose between bad or worse. But that aside, let's go ahead and move on to the second one. Now, this one was a bit of a toss-up, but I ended up choosing Vampire King. The other one that was up for a slot in here was the Urunaz, which is a dragon that many of you may recognize. Now, the Urunaz is known for its graveyard thievery, while the Vampire King is known for its consumption of the dead. Now, I couldn't justify putting both on the list since they are just so similar in theme. Though, when it came down to it, the Vampire King won out simply because it is cheaper, it is denying the creature from ever hitting the graveyard, which prevents on-graveyard effects from taking place, and it transforms that creature into something that the Blood Mage can use regardless. It's a decent creature that you can use in its own right without any problem, regardless of your deck. Now, it does that regardless of whether you're stealing a 0/1 Battle Hopper or a huge Tatalka Ascended. So, if you're getting a Tatalka Ascended, you're actually wanting the Urunaz. But if you're just getting a lot of weak guys, you're wanting the Vampire King. Now, obviously, the Urunaz is better against bigger creature decks where you're using Murder and things like, I'm forgetting the name of the card right now. Extinction, there we go. It meshes really good with that one because the Urunaz will steal things out of the graveyard, while the Vampire King meshes better with just beating the tar out of them, and it does pretty good with Murder, too. Because you can just get rid of them just like that right off the bat. And I just snapped and you probably couldn't hear it. Now, what are the stats on the Vampire King? They're actually decent. They're not great, but they're decent. They're not anywhere near Urunaz. But they're 4 cost, which is a whole heck of a lot cheaper than Urunaz. It's 2 blood threshold. It's a 3/3 vampire with flying that says when an opposing troop dies, if this troop is in play, it transforms that troop into a vampire and puts it into play under your control. Now, you'll note that it doesn't say that the Vampire King has to kill it. It just has to die while the Vampire King is in play, which means it meshes very, very well with removal spells. Exceptionally well, and it transforms it into a 2/2 flying creature, which means, hey, it's a new creature. Now, vampires themselves are 2/2 flyers, not much weaker than the king himself. So this is decent, and honestly, it can take out most other basic flyers relatively easily. Now, this is exceptionally strong in the initial set, as flight is not going to be exceptionally common, at least not until we have the initial block out. And even then, it might not be that common. We haven't seen the next two sets in the block. Now, it can easily trade with pretty much any opposing flyer, as I already said. Vampire King can outright kill a lot of flyers without even trading, unless they've been allowed to buff that flyer. And it works well with pretty much any mini removal, any murder, it would work in a variety of decks, basically. And it's a good tool to help you control swarms of enemy creatures because it allows you to create your own creatures by shutting those little ones down. So, and these are going to be decent flyers too, at that to boot. Now, it's worth noting that with all this talk of stealing enemy creatures, creating creatures, that someone somewhere is going to mention, well, what about Cruel Web Crawler? Cruel Web Crawler is a decent card, and it is along the same veins. It didn't even come close to getting into the 5 list because, well, it doesn't fly or evade. Otherwise, it would be exceptionally, probably overpowered. Its ability to turn an enemy life into creatures is an amazing tool, but simply put, the Vampire and Urunaz are guaranteed bombs because they evade, while Cruel Web Crawler is merely a neat trinket if you can get it past enemy blockers. Now, I'm on the fence as to whether I'm going to be flipping between the cards in the background here. Probably not. I'll include links to all the creatures mentioned in the description, though, because flipping between them would take forever in editing as I'm going back and forth between all of them. But anyway, for number 3, we're going to actually move away from creatures and move into the realm of deck manipulation, which is something I absolutely love. And we're going to be looking at a card that I mentioned multiple times, and that is Omen of Oblivion. Now, some people love this card, some people hate it. Some say it's too weak, others are enthralled with its potential strength, and some even think it's too strong. Personally, my opinion is very middling. It's not overpowered, it's not underpowered as some people say, and it kind of earns its place on the list because it gets my gears turning rather than being exceptionally powerful. It's essentially, if you break it all down, it's guaranteed removal for 1 resource. That's what it is. It can remove anything. It can remove a basic action, a creature, a spell. Anything that can be drawn can be stopped by this card. Now, the thing is, it's only guaranteed to actually have an effect if your opponent would draw the card to begin with. So it's good to place this on their keystone cards. They're cards that are essential to their deck. It also gives you a little bit of a scout into their deck, although you don't want to spend too long looking at that because, well, you'll run your timer down. Now, the major thing that makes this useful as opposed to, say, in Magic the Gathering where you have cards that, say, remove all of a specific name or remove a specific card, is that this card actually feeds into itself. If it removes a card into the void, you actually get another one of these cards to target yet another card in that opponent's deck. So not only does it create that issue of card disadvantage for them at one point, it'll have the potential to do it again. Now, if you get 2 or 3 of these cycling through an enemy deck, it can actually wreak some serious havoc by removing quite a few enemy cards without any real extra effort on your part. The downside is, as said, it relies on your opponent being unlucky enough to draw the card that you cursed. And another thing worth noting is if they draw that card and they're trying to top deck something, it would be a dead draw for them. That would be 0 cards drawn that turn because that card would be voided instead of going to their hand. So it kind of ruins any top deck hopes. Now, as far as the actual card specifics say, they sound great on paper, they sound awkward in implementation, but lots of potential. It's simply put a 1 cost, 1 blood threshold basic action that says look at target champion's deck and choose a card. It gets permanent. If this card would enter your hand from anywhere, void it instead. When the chosen card is voided, create an Omen of Oblivion and play it immediately without paying its cost, ignoring its threshold requirements. Simply put, it is a turn 1, let's see what we can stop in our opponent's deck kind of card. And it can be played later as well to decent effect. As the opponent's deck goes down, it gets much more effective. Now, as far as where I like this card and where I don't, I actually prefer it in draft over constructed. I would pick this card up in draft almost immediately if I saw it. While it's not on my top list of picks, it's definitely in the top 50% of my choices. It would be preferred over just a mediocre set of choices or just some halfway decent choices. It would be up there. Now, it is a solid pick because it can be used to remove an enemy bomb before it ever touches the field, because usually an enemy's only going to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 bomb cards in their deck that can give them those win conditions, unless they're just relying on overwhelming you with just numbers. Now, for constructed play, though, its ability can be combined with other cards for interesting effects, though honestly it just loses its effectiveness because most people in a constructed environment will be running 3 of or 4 of their win condition cards, making the removal much less impactful because, well, you can only hit so many of them, and you'd have to either focus on one card and get all of your Omen of Oblivions in play to actually remove that from the game, or you'd have to just get really, really lucky, just simply put. I'd rate this card so high because I just find it intriguing, not necessarily powerful, as I've said several times. I see its combinations as interesting. I see its ability to manipulate decks as interesting. Its scouting ability is interesting. And I find the most interesting thing about it would be to combine it with traps, deck order manipulators, mill spells, and just focus on mushing that enemy deck up into just this thinned out, trap-filled, nasty little mess of incoherent mush, so that anytime they're drawing, they're just kind of swallowing bile of hatred for you for making their deck just so nasty and vile-ridden grossness. And I see as further sets come out and you're able to further manipulate enemy decks, this actually might become a viable strategy that we honestly have never seen before, because the deck manipulation in this sense cannot exist in physical TCGs. This is why I really love this card. It's just an example of where things can go. It's an example of things we can use to create possibly yet another link in the food chain of TCGs. Because as it is, you have your rush decks, your combo decks, your burn decks, your control decks. Throw in a manipulator deck where its main goal is just to muck up your deck so bad that it is unplayable and you just get shut down by actually doing the very thing that is needed to play, which is draw cards, is kind of interesting to me. And I hope it doesn't become overpowered or anything, but I hope it at least becomes viable as a main strategy. Not going to use it in this first set, but I do see it coming as the cards increase in numbers. Omen of Oblivion will not be the overpowered card in the combo, though, so it's just kind of a hint at things to come. For the manipulation thing, we have all these lovely little things going on, and you can manipulate even graveyards and stuff like that with other cards, which is going to lead us into the fourth card, and I'm going to be jumping into the commons here, and this card only gets a slot simply because it gives me hope for something else in the future as well, and that is Call the Grave. Now, some of you are probably just face-palming and saying, why the heck is this crappy little card in here? Now, I have to say, this card on its own, I agree, it is very mediocre at best and constructed, and is pretty much useless in draft. Unless you are pulling that bomb back, it is just going to be dead weight. And this is kind of doubly true for the fact that it's a basic action instead of a quick action. The thing is, Call to the Grave indicates to me an openness to recursion decks, allowing for you to have the ability to cycle things in and out of your graveyard throughout the game. Whether it's to your hand, to your board, to your deck, it's fine. This openness to recursion makes me happy because it leads to an increased usefulness of things like permanent modifiers, on entry into play, effects, and yeah, it's also just a cheap card. But it's got all these beautiful effects. Now, the stats on the card are really, really basic. You can look at pretty much any Magic the Gathering set and you have an equivalent of this. But it's 1 casting cost, 1 blood threshold, basic action, put target troop from your graveyard into your hand. That's actually a little bit more cost effective than most Magic the Gathering equivalents. But yeah, that's something else to talk about entirely. The reason why I see recursion as so powerful is because, as I said, it meshes well with the permanent effects, but it also meshes well with enter play effects, leave play effects, sacrifice effects, etc. And it will make these permanent boosts that we keep seeing popping in, and that was subject of the second Hex, Friday Night Hex video, so much more powerful and so much more useful. And in addition to that, it can also be used quite simply to pull back bombs that have been removed in case of emergency. Now, it's not strong in and of itself. I'm going to openly say that one. It's just, as I've said a few times, it is a card that gives me hope. It's the first grain of sand in a recursion beach. Now, on the subject of grain of sands, though, I can't really leave Blood without talking about this one last card. It's the Swarmers Counter Swarm card, is what I'm just going to refer to it as. It is last in the list, and definitely not least, and that is Zombie Plague. all of you know I could not leave Blood alone without mentioning this card. It is easily, I mean hands down easily, my favorite card in the Blood arsenal that has been revealed so far. I am like fanboying over this thing. Now, you'll hear me go on and on about this card whenever the potential to bring it up comes out, because I absolutely love it. It's not overpowered directly. It is very powerful, don't get me wrong. And it is almost a guaranteed first pick / I'm going to go with Blood now material in draft. If I see it in draft, I'm like, give me and mine now. And it is a very powerful combo card in Constructed. So it is going to see a lot of play. And its stats are actually fairly cheap too, despite being so useful. It's 2 cost, 2 blood threshold constant that at the start of your turn add a plague counter to this constant. Then reveal a random troop from each opposing champion's deck for each plague counter on this constant. These troops get a permanent -1 attack, -1 defense. If a troop's defense is reduced to 0 this way, revert it, then transform it into a zombie and put it into play under your control. This is a scary spell if you read that. It will ramp up and simply put it'll demolish a deck while allowing the person using it to swarm. This card lends itself to being powerful against powerful in almost any early Blood deck. And I see it as being one of the top trending cards in the marketplace upon the release of the game. It's a triple function card that is exceptionally cheap. It does have semi-awkward threshold requirements, but it is so worth it. And for those of you wondering, triple function means it has debuffs, removal, and summoning. It's basically debuffs is its weakening of larger enemy creatures within a deck. It has light removal for removing smaller guys. It can even remove bigger guys, but the chances of it are fairly slim. And it has a summon effect in addition to this removal effect by creating 2/2 meat shields for you whenever its removal takes an opposing creature out. Now, this zombie plague card ramps up because, as you read at the beginning of it, at the start of your turn, add a plague counter to this constant. First turn, does nothing. Second turn, 1 -1 -1. At the second turn, it's out 2 -1s -1s. And it just keeps going up the longer the game goes. Meaning, towards the end, you are spamming these -1 -1 permanent effects. They're not even counters. They are permanent debuffs. You're spamming these onto them. And if you get 3 or 4 of these out, you are saying goodbye to enemy creatures just flat out. Now, personally, I think Zombie Plague should cost more. Possibly 3 cost 3 threshold. That's just my personal opinion. That would balance it out a little bit more, but it is a legendary. It's not going to be extremely common. It's going to be quite expensive to get, I'm willing to bet. So I don't see too many people having 4 of in it early on, because people are either going to be holding it or selling it for exorbitant amounts. But this is a card that I am definitely keeping my eye on. I will pick them up as soon as I can. And they are one of the reasons why I am leaning towards Blood. And with the recording going on for about 20 some odd minutes, I think that's about time for me to call it an episode, because if you follow YouTube stats, you guys probably aren't listening by here. But yeah, be sure to submit your ideas for what you'd like to hear as a card highlight segment in each episode. I'm probably going to include those at the end of each episode. And I will see you guys next time on Friday Night Hex. Be sure to suggest your ideas for episodes. I will be doing my own subjects as well. But yeah, keep gaming, have fun, peace out. This has been Alzorath. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.